This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Okay, I think we'll make a start. Firstly, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming to the seminar this evening. I'm David Winks. I'm one of the conveners of the seminar. Very fortunate to be joined this evening by Liz Haines, who's a PhD student in her third year at Royal Holloway in the Science Museum, presenting a paper, as you can see, about cartography in Northern Rhodesia. And following Liz's paper, we have an intriguing paper from Dr. Aparajita. I'm afraid I'm struggling to pronounce your surname.
That's fine, Aparajita is just fine.
Okay, that's fine. So we're going to have the two papers, around 20 minutes, and followed by some questions and answers. So I'd like to begin with Liz.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, and thank you everybody for coming along. So this afternoon I'm going to be presenting a history of mapping in Northern Rhodesia, which is the British colonial name for the territory which is now Zambia in southern Africa, and specifically I'll be focusing on the different kinds of labour involved in producing that cartography. So to summarise the larger project that this is part of, I'm aiming to really extend our understanding of what maps are doing in relationship to the imposition of power in colonial territories. Maps are not one kind of document, there are many kinds. And so I propose that differentiating better between various layers of cartographic documentation will generate a much clearer idea of how 20th century colonial governments understood, documented and managed their territory. So our current views of colonial mapping are warped, I would suggest, by three main poles. The first of these is the domination of French thought, and particularly Foucault, in our understanding of what the state is. This is, I would suggest, carried through in works such as Scott's Seeing Like a State, which describes a state whose vision, although imperfect, aims at omniscience. And I'd suggest that the hugely piecemeal nature of mapping in Northern Rhodesia speaks to a deliberate state ignorance. We see the government often acting in particular situations prior to accumulating any kind of knowledge, while in others expending huge amounts of money on detailed work. So secondly, a large amount of cartographic history and theory stems from situations where maps are used in crisis and conflict situations. And third of these distorting factors is the domination of the British mapping of India in the historiography of colonial cartography, due to the colossal achievement of Matthew Edney, which, unlike most British colonial mapping, actually does follow the pattern of territorial documentation in the kind of mode of Foucault and Scott. So these general theoretical frameworks are unsuitable for considering much of African colonial cartography, which took place in a largely peaceful, at least for the colonialists, civil rather than military environment, and one which was driven largely by commercial rather than political demands. So by choosing to look at the work involved in constructing these maps, we can reveal some of these layers and also see how the process of compiling cartography was embedded in some of the larger forces at work in British colonial Africa. To do so, you have to go further than the cartographic archives in the metropole and try and piece together the documents of daily life and working practice in cartography from the remaining archives in the colonies. So in order to look at some of these questions, we'll be following three different maps that were created, we'll be looking at the work of three different cartographers that were working to represent a specific area of Northern Rhodesia, the Gwembe Valley. So I'm just going to very quickly introduce you to the Gwembe Valley. The borders of Northern Rhodesia follow those of today's Zambia, so this is just a reminder of everyone of where Zambia is. In a very quick outline, the main resources of the country are concentrated in two main areas. So the copper belt at the top, where it borders with the DRC, and on the main north-south route, so sort of that follows kind of past where it says Zambia and then down through Lusaka to here, which is Livingstone. And this is this route. This stretch here is heavily farmed, and the Gwembe Valley lies here along the Zambezi, where it borders, where the river forms a border with Zimbabwe. So next, so here, now we're looking at this part here. You can see more clearly the demarcation of the Gwembe district, which. In this one here, you can see more clearly the demarcation of the Gwembe district, which falls more or less from the escarpment down to where the river was. And you can see from this image that a good percentage of the valley was flooded by Lake Kariba from about 1958. So the surface of the lake, just on the Zambian side of the border, is approximately the size of Cambridgeshire. So obviously that's a very large stretch of land. And I'm not going to talk about the dam and the hydroelectric project, on which there's been quite a lot of work already, but I want you to imagine peeling back the waters of the lake in your mind, because that area at the bottom of the valley is what our three cartographers will be documenting. So three different cartographers. The first of our cartographers was working in 1913. His name was Fairweather, a Scottish surveyor working for the Survey Department of the British South Africa Company. So the PDF which I sent round contains some extracts from his diary at that time. The second of these cartographers was working in the Directorate of Colonial Surveys, which was coordinating mapping work from London. The second set of the documents in the PDF refer to the structure and organisation of that institution. And then finally, the third mapping project was carried out in 1954 by Muzume Mateo, an African assistant surveyor who was commissioned to carry out survey work by the provincial administrators. So that's the regional administration that were responsible for the Gwembe Valley. Now, of these three projects, the work of Fairweather in 1913 is probably closest to what we typically imagine of colonial cartography, not least because this project bears the most relation to the kind of cartography produced by explorers and missionaries in the 19th century. On Thursday the 16th of September, Fairweather was 12 days into a survey tour that would last just over 6 months and involve 600 miles of walking. The group's primary goal was cadastral survey, so measuring out the land in the valley, which is in fact just 2 small farms, that had been claimed by Europeans, so that final title deeds to these properties could be issued by the Land Office. Fairweather was travelling with Eccles, who was a trainee surveyor, and at times as many as 50 men, plus the wife and the child of the party's cook. In return for ticketed wages, those men heaved and hauled the surveyor's camp equipment, survey tools and personal ephemera from place to place. So this isn't Fairweather's original map of the farm boundaries of one of the farms. It's a direct copy which was sketched into the district notebook while the survey team were camped at the headquarters of the Gwembe district. So Fairweather's tour was typical of survey in that period. Cadastral survey was seen as a necessity, but it occupied most of the survey department's time. The nobler scientific task of creating topographic maps of the territory didn't bring in a sizable income, and so it was undertaken in scraps of moments between jobs producing title deeds. Nonetheless, Fairweather despised the cadastral work and saw the topography as his raison d'etre, an ideal that was bound up in the scientific adventure of empire. Despite his status as a salaried employee, he imagined himself in the style of the 19th century gentleman explorer. He collected insects, noted and shot game, he botanised and built a photographic record of his journey. So that's that you can see that in the extracts there. The porters were also carrying his volumes of Plutarch's Lives, Darwin's Journal of Researches and Macaulay's History of England across the valley. So most of Fairweather's notes concern the details of distances and heights, the courses of rivers and outlines of hills. These, however rough, were nonetheless considered valuable information to a government that knew so little of its territory. And Fairweather was, of course, himself aware of how sketchy they really were. After one night of astronomical observations, for example, he noted that he was approximately 20 degrees and 55 minutes east of Greenwich. And he says, you can put a point on the map just about where we are. So there's by no means a any kind of precision. Well, there's a precision, but it's not the kind of precision we associate with topographic work. So these white European surveyors at work in the territory did not necessarily have professional qualifications as such. Fairweather in 1913 was hired on the basis of exams taken in geometrical and constructive drawing, and was later described as a man of self-won knowledge. His assistant in the field, Eccles, was employed straight from graduation in an unknown specialism from Cambridge, but even after a year of service in the survey department, he had still never done one of the most basic forms of survey, the traverse. So it seems that a mathematical education of a basic kind and a fairly good hand was sufficient to be able to carry out the level of work required by the government at this time, and the same surveyors who paced across the landscape were the ones who calculated and drew the maps in the office. So, I'm not sure how clearly you can see that in this slide, but what we're looking at are those two figures here who are working in the stereo plotting machines, which I'm going to describe. So, in 1950, in Greater London, a young woman who I haven't identified her name, would have been sat at a stereo plotter working in the Directorate of Colonial Surveys as a cartographer. So she would have been folded into a large mechanical device like this, and she was working from the aerial photographs that had been taken from an RAF plane over the Gwembe Valley. These photographs had made their way to the UK some weeks earlier by steamer, and at the RAF Photographic Unit in Benson, Oxfordshire, they had been processed into 6 sets of prints and then passed speedily on to the Directorate of Colonial Survey's headquarters in Tolworth. Cartographer X, however, was far from being an expert. This position was her first after leaving secondary education. She was picked from a cohort of interviewees with adequate school-leaving certificates at the ordinary level, and many of her colleagues were clearly expected to still be living with their parents at home. So these recruits learned their trade literally on the production line of the maps of empire. In 1950, there were 173 of these young cartographers at work in the Directorate. Opportunities for moving up the ranks were few and far between, the ratio of supervisors to staff being in the region of 1 to 40. So the maturation of many of these young female cartographers into marriage and domestic life suited the Directorate well. So here you can see the kinds of machines she would have been working with. This is in fact of an office in Canada, but it's a similar setup. And most of all, it gives you an idea of just how completely different this work is from Fairweather's work in the field, where he was doing calculations and sketching in his tent in quiet moments, with only handheld instruments and very basic ones. The Directorate of Colonial Surveys had been established in 1946 to tackle the 3/4 of the colonial empire, so that's 1.5 million square miles, 3/4 of the empire in 1946 that still had no topographical maps. The Directorate's goal was to produce 80,000 square miles of mapping a year in a system they described as concentrated dispersion. When centrally organised, surveyors and aeroplanes could be sent to follow field seasons from one climatic zone to another. The rest of the task could be geographically relocated to the metropole. The calculations were done by the human computing department in another part of the building, and printing was done at yet another site. Cartographer X's job was purely to trace over predetermined features that she identified on the photographs. So again, this is the organogram, and I'm not sure that the light... I've just sort of highlighted the parts which were relevant, but this is an organogram, and you can see here that this is the listing of the different cartographic sections, so of which she would have been a member. And then you can see that more or less at the same sort of level on the organogram are stores assistants, typists, watchmen and carpenters. And here, that's also from the document I sent you before. You really get an idea of just how close to a factory line this was, how close the cartographic work had become to sort of automated work in other industries. That's a sort of breakdown of the different cartographic work. So, although the Directorate of Colonial Surveys was also founded with the ideal of producing standard topographic maps as the scientific basis for the development, like the Northern Rhodesian Survey Department in the early 20th century, they'd been distracted from the task by work that was more commercially pressing. So Cartographer X is in fact drawing a map of Gwembe based on survey work that had been prioritised because it served a potential rail link from the southeast into Northern Rhodesia. And this is an example of one of the maps. Again, this isn't ideal. One of the kind of maps that were being produced by the DCS. This isn't, again, of the Gwembe Valley, but it is from Northern Rhodesia. And I'm not sure that you'll be able to see on this map that in the end, in order to kind of secure the sufficiently rapid production, most of the maps of Northern Rhodesia were actually produced without contour lines. That's how that's the kind of, and they were again focused on areas where there needed to be, where commercial companies and sort of large international development was going to take place. So, these two cartographic projects of the Gwembe Valley in 1913 and 1951 generated the only systematic, standard issue topographic maps of the Gwembe Valley produced during the colonial period. So that's two in an interval of more than 40 years. And if you can imagine, these were the only cartographic documents that could be used by anyone who was working there or planning on working there. And both of these projects were effectively the byproduct of cartographic work being done for commercial purposes. So, of course, other kinds of maps were being produced, but these were never published, and so they're therefore rarely discussed by cartographic historians. They weren't systematic or precise beyond the bare necessity, because they were measured and sketched for specific purposes, and then used until they disintegrated or were filed away. The colonial government didn't gather that information centrally or impose any kind of order on it, and so this genre of maps is now found scattered through the Zambian archives and records relating to administration, tribal boundary disputes, public works, irrigation, and so on. So wider policy that affected the whole of the valley, the whole of that district, policy regarding agricultural improvement, demographics, irrigation and so on, was being carried out without systematic maps or with very little information. So this is a sort of example of the maps which were more typically the sort of sketch maps that were being used in everyday work rather than any kind of reliance on the larger topographic maps. These sort of, to explain what this is a map drawn up to define the boundaries of chieftainships in another part of Northern Rhodesia. These ad hoc maps for governance were in the early years sometimes drawn by white surveyors such as Fairweather or Eccles, but often produced as best could be by other colonial officials with even less training or practice in survey. Gradually, however, between 1913 and the 1950s, they were increasingly the responsibility of black Africans trained in survey. This was formalised in the 1940s after a school was established, along with a grade in the African Civil Service entitled African Assistant Surveyor. Recruits to the African Survey School were required to have passed at least 5 years of primary education, which meant they had acquired basic numeracy and literacy skills. Their 2-year course at this school equipped them with far more survey education than the white surveyors such as Fairweather or Eccles had had at the outset of their career, and they were, as was pointed out in the 1940s, some of the most skilled cartographic workers in the territory. After their 2 years of training, the African assistant surveyors were assigned posts embedded within other government departments who would then designate their projects. So, in 1954, Muzume Mateo, African assistant surveyor, was occupied on a project mapping the African township which had grown up around the administrative headquarters in Gwembe. Although he was trained to use brass instruments, levels, theodolites and so on, in the field his equipment most likely consisted of a compass, tape or chain and cyclometer. Unlike Fairweather, Mateo would have had no porters, except perhaps in the case of travelling to the most distant reaches of the district, so he would have been responsible for the transfer of his own technical kit, uniform and personal affairs as he moved across the valley. In November of that year, he was working at the office, either with the minimal stationery available at district headquarters, or with the supplies of squared paper, tracing sheets, rules, pencils, rubbers and pens that he carried with him. So these are 3 cartographers of very different kinds, and I've been hinting at some of the levels of training and skill that was considered necessary for each of these posts, but I want to recap very quickly. In the early part of the period, the process of mapping was generally followed through from field all the way to the printing block by one single individual who was uniformly white and male. This person didn't require any specific training, although there were approximate criteria that would allow a candidate to be considered appropriate, covering a wide range of skills. These cartographers were carrying out both topographic scientific mapping and cadastral work relating to white-owned property in the valley. Other mapping was being carried out on an ad hoc basis with whatever resources the relevant colonial official could cobble together. By the 1950s, the various stages involved in topographic scientific mapping were distributed across centres of expertise at an imperial scale, with the coordination of work taking place in the UK. Mapping for administrative purposes or public works that had previously been done ad hoc was now being done more systematically, but by trained black African surveyors rather than by apprenticed white colonial officials. The projects that had social value, so these projects, and longer-term economic values, but with a much slower return, were being carried out by the cheapest labour using the cheapest equipment. In the meantime, the number of white surveyors in the Northern Rhodesian Survey Department had remained approximately static, but these were now occupied almost entirely by either managing survey projects or, still, by mapping title deeds to white-owned property. And the boom in European acquisition of land after the Second World War had created more of this cadastral work than ever. Mapping related to large infrastructural projects or international financial investments, projects such as cross-border rail links, new industrial-scale plantations, or the hydroelectric dam project at Kariba, was coordinated and controlled from London, and this expensive survey project work would be funded by the Colonial Office. So, to conclude, the mapping of the Gwembe Valley can't really be considered representative of cartography in Northern Rhodesia because the huge unevenness of documentation across the territory mean that there is no real typical mapping history. But it can, however, be considered somewhat typical of cartography of areas that had no specific commercial interest to the colonial government. Where land in Northern Rhodesia did not appear to be sufficiently profitable to tempt white landowners, it remained undocumented. Mapping in Northern Rhodesia followed capital. Until the 1950s, there was little or no commercial value in view for the Gwembe Valley, so cartographic documentation remained at the most fragmentary level for most of the colonial period. And this is also reflected in the ways in which political and scientific authority in cartography was reordered as mapping was reorganised. Interestingly, even scientific forms of mapping could be undertaken by white women and by black men, although of course it was still coordinated by white men. But cadastral mapping, the cartographic documents that had direct economic significance, remained the domain of the white male surveyor. The tasks for large-scale mapping projects were increasingly distributed across different states, but the most developed technologies and expertise were retrenched in the metropole. So I hope that I've demonstrated, or at least begun to demonstrate, that the absence of published cartography of regions such as Gwembe that lay outside of areas associated with white capital investment strongly suggests a reconsideration of how the state operated territorial definitions in British colonial Africa, and certainly pushes against a Foucauldian approach to state knowledge. And the sources that David kindly distributed last week, and some of the ones I've showed here, I hope will be a prompt to thinking about the working lives in colonial cartography. And that's one of the things I'd be particularly interested in talking to you all about. Particularly, I'm interested in how we draw together links between these working lives and the kind of knowledge that the colonial state was producing. And I hope that the project as a whole, and again, I'd be interested to see if there's anyone who'd be interested in talking about this, will also provide some beginnings for an understanding of disparities in the density of knowledge and the availability of expertise that remain in Zambia and across similar former British colonies today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Liz. That's great. Now, a paper from Aparajita.
Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you for having me over in this conference, in this seminar. This is part of the paper which I'll be presenting here today is part of a much longer paper. So, and I know within my given stipulated time of 20 minutes, what I will try to do is to skim through the main arguments and the main evidence, and so that it will help me to interpret the conclusions to which I have reached. So, and I hope that during the question and answer session, we'll be able to generate some more detailed discussions. Travel literature as a genre had long since contributed to our understanding of literary texts and the social contexts and the politics of representations. Travelogues have been read not only as descriptive accounts of travel, but as an ideological apparatus of imperialism. Theoretical assumptions spawned by such researches has been applied to the travelogues written in Indian languages in the colonial period, mainly to explore the link between travel writing, the colonial state, and the nations. Scholars have shown through these travelogues, through critical reading of Indian language travelogues, that the nationalist bourgeois were contesting and creating ideas of nation, history, cultural identity, and territory. Useful as these studies are, they however overlook the ways in which the contents and the aesthetic and the literary sensibilities of the travelogues were influenced by European guidebooks. In other words, if vernacular travelogues were shaping notions of history and community in colonial India, then exploring the specifics which influence these narratives may offer possibilities to reassess the impact of the travelogues and their consequences in a new perspective. My paper explores the ways in which European guidebooks, especially railway guidebooks, influenced Indian travelogues and the Indian journeys, and the impact of this on the nature of journeys in colonial India. It will pay particular attention to the ways in which Indian guides and travelogues both replicated and moderated the colonial discourse of the European guidebooks. Here, I argue that though one cannot deny that travelogues borrowed from the European guidebooks, a closer analysis reveals that this process cannot be discounted as merely derivative. On the contrary, it was a complex process in which the travelogues imitated, but also in crucial ways, both differed and even contested the colonial discourse of the European guidebooks. Further, This uneven and complex interaction, I argue, influenced how people felt or interpreted their travel experiences, which had implications for Indian society. In colonial context, guidebooks have been read as products of the most advanced stages of Orientalism, fulfilling an important ideological function in European imperialism. In case of India, with the exception of the work of Laura Baer and Nitin Sinha, the social and political impact of guidebooks has received little attention. Baer argues that travel literature and guidebooks offered a scriptural economy to European railway travelers, which allowed them to gaze at a picturesque India from the safety of a railway carriage, untouched by the despotic presence of the colonial state. In a more recent contribution, Nitin Sinha has claimed that a standardized way of seeing was as much shaped by the text as it was by the tracks the travelers followed. Both these descriptions bring out crucial elements: the nature of the imperial traveling gaze and a calibration of travel circuits formalized by railway network. Such analysis, though not inaccurate, however, overlook the likelihood of Indians using these guidebooks, significance of which and its implications would be discussed in this paper. The advent of guidebooks in India was primarily linked to the introduction of railways in the mid-19th century. As in Europe, guidebooks in India were published as a portable source of useful information to aid travelers in planning their journeys. Consequently, the design, style, and layout of Indian guidebooks were heavily influenced by their European counterparts. Among other things, the European railway guidebooks in India contained timetables, tariff charts, a glossary of useful terms in the main languages of the districts which the line traversed, and the descriptive notes about the passing landscape. These notes contained information about the physical setting, historic assumption, and ethnographic details of the region covered by the railway network. Initially, much of this information was taken from the military route books. Though useful, these sources contained minimum descriptive details. The publishers were aware of this drawback and looked for suitable sources to supplement the information. The solution was found in the district gazetteers, monograph written by officials serving in particular areas, and pre-railway travel accounts by Europeans. The practice of using these sources for railway guidebooks became commonplace. Borrowing from common sources made the guidebooks formulaic and repetitive. Nevertheless, they were quite popular and went through repeated edition, partly because they were cheap, easily available, and more importantly, the concise and portable nature of the information, combining features of practical utility with ready-to-use knowledge about destinations, was helpful for the traveler when planning an itinerary. The arrangement of information also added to its utility. Though the criteria for grading places was never made apparent, a hierarchy of places certainly existed. From the descriptive notes, it can be argued that this hierarchy was determined by two factors: easy accessibility, usually through railways, and a concentration of places of interest both in and around the location. This touristic valuation did not replace the old sacred geography, but augmented it. While other hierarchies persisted, leisure travel on the railways introduced another register of relative importance: the sites. The overlapping of travel purposes explains why the hierarchy induced by the guidebooks was successful in becoming popular within a short span of time. Interestingly, this classification was also influenced by pre-existing Indian notions about relative importance of places. Banaras, for instance, was at the top of the hierarchy because it was described as a place which Hindus considered to be most sacred. Though such appellations certainly underline the creation and dissemination of a specific kind of knowledge about India, it would be instructive to note that at some level this knowledge had indigenous elements. The guidebooks also introduced new aesthetic and literary sensibilities of seeing landscape, particularly the notion of picturesque. European guidebooks in the late 19th century was influenced by the aesthetic ideals of picturesque, a romantic sensibility which posed a challenge to Enlightenment rationalist ideas about aestheticism. In India, the picturesque aesthetic was sought after by the European travelers even before the arrival of the guidebooks, although the trend escalated thereafter. Indians too came to be influenced by this ideal. It is evident in the travelogues, more of which later, but suffice here would be to note that inspired by the picturesque, travelers sought beauty not in ordered regularity but in wild, romantic and quaint. The irregular, anti-classical ruins and even ruined people, the ragged poor, viewed from a safe distance became sought-after themes. As the foregoing discussion suggests, guidebooks were accessible and portable source of information. Not surprisingly, among Indians possessing knowledge of English, consulting guidebooks became an established travel practice. Evidently, though, the publishers of the guidebooks initially did not anticipate this Indian audience. The preface of the first edition of the Bradshaws were unequivocal about their prospective readership. The preface noted the need for a through route guide for those who came to India for official or non-official reasons. Murray's volumes too offered hints to travelers which included information on the best seasons to visit India. This practice, however, was not universal. In the Newman's volumes, for instance, the section on hints to travelers was conspicuous by its absence. Moreover, as the Newman's volumes began to be published about the same time as the Bradshaws, 1860s, therefore such differences cannot be explained as a late attempt to calibrate the information to the needs of an Indian audience. Interestingly, Indians using railway English guidebooks did not seem perturbed that their content was aimed at the British traveller. However, by the turn of the century, Indian publishers realized that there was a demand for vernacular guides which could cater to a wider audience. The Indian language guidebooks closely imitated their English predecessors, though some differences can be identified. For instance, sections such as what to wear were absent, and the list of accommodation was widened to differentiate between hotels owned by Hindus or Muslims. But the descriptive notes were not altered, and there does not seem to be any intention in vernacular guides to contest or provide an alternative to the narrative presented in the English versions. Indian readers do not seem to have been exceedingly alienated by references meant exclusively for Europeans, which in any cases were few. The acceptance and reproduction of the content of English railway guidebooks by Indians challenges a binary division of colonizer versus colonized. But if these texts allowed European passengers to pass intact through the landscape collecting the picturesque, how did they influence their Indian readers? Indian travelogues of the period suggest that the Indian readers of the railway guidebooks not only consumed the same narratives, but also perceived and articulated their relationship to the passing landscape and its inhabitants in terms that were often very similar to those appearing in these volumes. Scriptural economy, Michael Sertu argues, gives symbolic articulation to the Occidental ambition to compose its history and thus to compose history itself. For him, the modern Western culture transforms, invents, and represses the other through the practice of writing, which in essence, therefore, is also an inscription of power. This idea is certainly valid, but it does not preclude the possibility of others too yielding scriptural apparatus with similar, if not identical, results. In other words, I argue that by borrowing the literary and aesthetic sensibilities from European sources, especially guidebooks, the authors of the Indian language's travelogues created a distinct narrative which had its own others, and this process had implications for Indian society. While it can be argued, as some scholars have, that these instances of the influence of European in the Indian travelogues is symbolic of colonization of self, and these texts therefore merely reproduce colonial discourse, I suggest that the process was more complex. The travelogue certainly borrowed from European sources, a process which is indicative of both the emergence of travel writing as a distinct genre in colonial India and a commentary on those who wrote these narratives. The authors of these travelogues belong to urban middle class, most of whom, or at least in most cases all of whom, had received varying degrees of Western education and therefore conveniently drew upon literary sensibilities from the European texts. At the same time, the European influence was appropriated with discretion, and not all ideas were blindly imitated. Moreover, the European sensibilities were criticized both subtly and otherwise. The influence on the guidebooks on the travelogues is evident in the literary style, the description of landscape, the gradation of places, and the ideas of distance and difference. Of all things, the influence of the aesthetic sensibility of the picturesque is clearly noticeable, particularly in describing areas of India, especially Bengal, and the regions around it, comparisons between the physical features of Bengal and the northwestern provinces, and the description of Delhi and Rajasthan. For instance, one author, writing in 1878, he opened his travelogue with a quote from Byron, referring to the soul's desire to meditate amongst decay and stand amidst ruins. His account of Tin Pahar and ruins of Raj Mahal is instructive because these rugged features, he suggested, broke the monotony of Bengal's verdant but plain landscape. Ruggedness and non-uniformity of physical setting were among the main features of a picturesque vision, and therefore mountains, ruins of forts, abandoned cities, and even railway tunnels were seen as providing a suitable backdrop to describe the picturesque. Railway guidebooks' influence can also be discerned on the idea of the educative benefits of travel. The idea that leisurely travel should be useful was an European notion, which viewed traveling as a means of personal improvement to complement or challenge textual knowledge. In this tradition, the pedagogical function of travel meant extending one's particular perspective by seeing other lands and people. This belief had its fair share of critiques, and the idea of incommensurability questioned its credibility. But the weight of empirical experience as well as the pleasure derived from travel usually offset this challenge. The authors of the travelogues were evidently influenced by the idea of travel as education. Traveling, all the authors of these travelogues argued, broadened horizons by offering opportunity to know the land and its inhabitants. Guidebooks also influence the underlying discourses shaping the narratives of the travelogue. This mainly consisted in borrowing excerpts from the guidebooks to supplement their own narrative. This use was justified by claiming that guidebooks were repositories of reliable information, and the content therefore could be used without hesitation. In addition, some authors used gazetteers and other government publications, including the census report. At one level, the use of these sources certainly reflects the ways in which educated Indians since the mid-19th century onwards were influenced by the positivistic historical methodologies of the West, which underline the significance of authoritative texts and knowledge. But at another, it challenges the assumption that such knowledge production and training had hegemonic influence, if only because these authors also used mythologies and folklores as valid sources. One author, for instance, described a region of Raipur in central India in a strikingly linear narrative. He identified it as a Koshal Rajya of the epic Ramayana, then noted its history under the Bhonsles, Maratha rulers, finally describing its present status as the district headquarters under the rule of Nagpur's chief commissioner. And he was not an exception. There were, however, two disadvantages of copying the content of guidebooks. One, the borrowed portions lacked individual insight, and two, more importantly, they tended to reciprocate or reproduce the relationship between the travelers and their object of observation, which informed the sensibilities of the guidebooks. For instance, the authors of the travelogues frequently expressed their fascination with passing landscape in terms similar to those used in guidebooks. In a striking example of using distance to appreciate vision, Surendranath Ray described his first sighting of Taj Mahal from a railway carriage, wondering if his actual visit to the monument next morning would match up to the first glimpse. It was no coincidence that his description corresponded with the one recorded by Rudyard Kipling on his first sight of Taj. More importantly, colonial ethnography carried into these guidebooks was frequently deployed to describe difference between people of India. The travelogues routinely described North Indians as manly in appearance. Phrases such as sturdy Marathas, entrepreneurial Parsis, indolent Muslims, and brave Rajputs were liberally borrowed. But here again, the usage of such colonial stereotypes reveal a careful process of selection. And it would be instructive to note that by translating these stereotypes into the vernacular, Indian travelogues therefore not only replicated these ideas but disseminated them to a wider audience. As the foregoing discussion demonstrates, the travelogue certainly borrowed the aesthetic and literary sensibilities of the guidebooks, but this influence, though wide, was not indiscriminate. The borrowing was based on a selective use of information and sensibilities that created an appropriate narrative to convey the experience of distance and difference engendered by frequent traveling, primarily due to the introduction of railways. This process of selection is instructive, as some ideas and information were appropriated while others were not. Opposing descriptions of Kanpur and the events of 1857 illustrate this point well. In the guidebooks, the description of Kanpur usually emphasized its association with 1857, reminding travelers of the atrocious barbarity which Indian sepoys inflicted on the British, especially on the women and children. On the contrary, in the travelogues, the burden of guilt was not put squarely on Indians. For instance, after a visit to the Mutiny Memorial, poet Naveen Chandra Sen wrote, and I quote, "Kanpur saddens one's heart, but violence and cruelty were inflicted by both sides," quote closed. Similarly, other authors admitted that while the killing of British women and children in captivity in Kanpur was a deplorable act, yet this action was argued to be a desperate measure which was a part of a wider campaign to oppose the century-old atrocities of the English East India Company. Differences were also expressed on other topics, for instance, in the use of the aesthetic ideal of picturesque. The guidebooks claimed that the picturesque vision of ruins and abandoned cities conveyed that India's greatness lay in her past. Such descriptions argued that over centuries, India has progressively declined, having reached a state of decay and degeneration from which the British were extricating her. The travelogues too, as noted, used the ruins for similar aesthetic appeal. But they interpreted the historical meaning of such visions with a singular difference. For the authors of the travelogues, the ruins conveyed that India would again regain her lost glory and that Indians, not the British, would achieve this objective. The implications of this interpretation was clear. The role of the British in the regeneration of India was peripheral and limited. It had another distinct element. Indian failings needed reforms to be achieved by recovering evidence of a great past. Further, even the borrowing and usage of stereotypes for both places and people reveal a careful process of selection and appropriation. For instance, most authors of the Bengali travelogues claimed that though Bengal's geographical characteristics may have led to certain weakness among its inhabitants, yet the land was fertile and therefore produced more food than more drier parts of India. Moreover, the verdure of Bengal was argued to be a feature of beauty which other regions lacked. More importantly, it is instructive that while descriptions such as indolent and barbarous Muslims or uncivilized Biharis were used without any misgivings, a conscious attempt was made to counter the colonial stereotype of Bengal and Bengalis, which was unflattering and deprecatory. The authors of these travelogues created a counter-narrative of self-representation, claiming themselves, Bengalis, as superior to non-Bengalis. Thus, I argue that the sensibilities appropriated from guidebooks were deployed in diverse contexts and purposes to suit specific Indian/Bengali needs. While some ideas were accepted without any change, others were moderated and even criticized. It is not without significance that the stereotypes associated with the Muslims and Muslim rule in India were not challenged. On the contrary, descriptive accounts of the guidebooks and their underlying assumptions were accepted. For instance, after a visit to Lucknow, one author claimed that the city failed to elicit any emotion from him because, and I quote, "its fall was a matter of regret only for Muslims. As far as Indians or Hindus were concerned, they had lost their independence long ago when Prithviraj was defeated at Delhi." Such sentiments had implications for Indian society, the significance of which is beyond the scope of the paper. These evidences, however, complicates the relationship of this indigenous response and challenges what Nitin Sinha describes as dominant colonial discourses, because such discriminating usage questions the hegemony of the colonial discourse and implies Indian agency and a discerning and non-derivative use of the guidebooks. To conclude, This paper demonstrates, or at least hopefully has demonstrated, that the travelogues written by Indians played a crucial role in transforming nature of journeys in colonial India, by which I mean how journeys were interpreted and which had wider implications. This process, I argue, was shaped by the literary and aesthetic sensibility of the European guidebooks, which influenced the content of the travelogues. But this influence, I suggest, was not as dominated by colonial discourse as scholars hitherto have assumed. On the contrary, this influence was never total, and exhibit a careful selection of ideas and information suitable for specific needs, as also moderation and even refusal of the colonial discourse. Moreover, this process of borrowing was not random. It had specific purposes, and consequently only those evidences were selected which helped to create a specific narrative of India's past, present and future, with ideas of difference and other sharpened as well as modified. Such processes, I argue, challenges the notion of hegemonic colonial discourse and also demonstrates the ways in which scriptural economies could be used and appropriated by others, mostly non-Europeans in this case, in a manner strikingly similar to Europeans. In conclusion, I suggest that the transformation of the nature of journeys as mediated through the travelogues certainly altered the relationship between travelers and their surroundings. Such sentiments had profound impact on imagining the nation and its people, significance of which is beyond the scope of this paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aparajita. So we've had two really interesting papers, and I think there's some links there between them, sort of both pointing to a sense of caution around reading sort of into the effects of these colonial discourses being totalising and completely hegemonic. So I'm going to open up the floor to questions. And given that no one has leapt forward, perhaps I might jump in with questions. So perhaps thinking about what Aparajita was saying about how the guidebooks were used and interpreted and in a way retranslated in India, I was just wondering if we could sort of think about that in relation to the maps that were produced in Rhodesia. I just wondered whether there was any sort of comparative process that took place, or any way in which sort of maps that were produced for ostensibly colonial purposes were used by inhabitants there, local people.
So I'd say it depends very much on the kind of map that's being produced. So obviously some maps like this are much more accessible to kind of altering or to kind of sort of retranslation or alternative uses than the ones which were sort of produced at the sort of topographic kind of directorate end of the scale. I think that one of the cases that I've been looking at, which I think is very interesting, is that these kinds of maps which were used to draw up approximations of the territories belonging to different headmen in chief. I mean, maps were definitely something which the local district officers used to try and kind of implement an idea of order or orderliness amongst those different people. But you can see sort of changes through the period. So by the end of the period, I think in the 1950s, there's a case where the chiefs actually begin asking for maps in order to actually defend their own notion of territory. They understand that maps have that kind of value, and that they can use them as a sort of like a way to materialise or sort of make more concrete their claims. And in fact, where the district officers, I mean, they don't actually produce a map or not anything sort of very complex. In one of the cases where the dispute continues, then they actually take the claim to court. So again, that's another place where those kinds of structures or functions become sort of adapted or reappropriated by the colonised, but they are, yeah, I mean, I guess that's the best case I have.
Can I thank both speakers for very interesting papers? I have a question about the use of these guidebooks. I know it's very difficult to reconstruct how texts were used and read, but have you encountered any evidence of real travellers or real readers having used these books?
Yeah, actually, I kind of didn't read out that portion. I had like names of authors who have kind of, who admitted that they have used the guidebooks, and they have admitted that one of them admitted that it's like his 3 decades old practice of consulting guidebooks. And when he was saying 3 decades, the travelogue in which he's admitting this, it was published in about 1890s. So if we push back the dates to 3 decades, it can be only European guidebooks and English guidebooks he was reading, because the Indian languages guidebooks first appear, the Bengali one, the first Bengali one appears in 1894, and the first Hindi one appears in about 1896, which was not quite, the Hindi one was not quite a guidebook, but it was kind of a sort of a pilgrim's guidebook to one of the main pilgrimage centers, if that answers your question. So there's a lot of evidence they're talking, and in fact they quite kind of admit that they have used these reliable government sources. And this kind of attracted my attention, that what they thought to be reliable and without questioning, and what kind of information was being gleaned from it.
I've got a question actually. I was really interested about this, and I'm sorry I missed the first paper, just thinking right now. I really enjoyed the second one. This Byron quote that was like sitting at the beginning of one of the Indian travelogues.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. And I mean, do you read this as a kind of inhabitation of a kind of colonial Englishness, as a kind of romantic poet or romantic kind of travellers, or does it have some kind of other tradition coming into it? I mean, there is always a kind of class in every society, or kind of caste or whatever, social stratification and so on. So is there kind of vernacular traditions playing into this kind of habitation of this romantic figure, travelling figure, or is it wholesale borrowing, that kind of Byronic?
Thank you. That's a very interesting question, because it is not wholesale borrowing. Yeah, again, I use this specific example to kind of, to augment my argument. But some of the Sanskrit poets, like Kalidasa and all that, because they're traveling mainly during like summer vacations. Most of these travelogues are written when authors are traveling during their summer vacations or Durga Puja holidays in the autumn break. So they're talking about these romantic sensibilities, if you want, drawing their inspiration as much as from the English or the European sources, as many from, say, the Sanskrit poets such as most notably Kalidasa. So there is this references to these floating clouds and the vision which kind of brings to them all that sort of thing. So there is definitely Indian and indigenous elements into it, but the fusion of it is very interesting, and more importantly, what kind of conclusions they are reaching from these using such kind of quotes. So in the first, this is a 2-volume travelogue actually, and if it interests you, the first volume begins with a quote by Byron. And the second volume begins with a quote by an Indian poet, and not just any Indian poet, someone who was then becoming popular as a nationalist poet, if you want. And he is also talking about ruins, but in a completely different way, as I suggested. So he's bringing together these two notions, as I said, to reach very different conclusion, and that's what interested me in these interpretations, how they were interpreted, if that answers your question.
Yeah.
I thought you were great on this kind of scriptural disruption, but I'm interested in what that happens when it's on the ground, as it were. So I'm just thinking especially about Lucknow, when there's that famous garden with the marble angel for the Indian mutiny, where Indians weren't allowed in until 1947.
Right.
What happens when they are confronted with that very physical kind of black
evidence?
White,
I mean, on that, it's kind of, in every travelogue I have read, the access to mutiny memorials even was seen as a point of contention, if you want, and that's like, that comes out as the point from which this conversation, if you want, triggers off, that this is a sign of being kind of, this is inequality and and all this sort of thing, that the blame is squarely on us, but while we were not the only ones to be blamed, and so on. So I can't tell you, from these travelogues, because they were written from mid-19th to early 20th century onwards, I can't answer your specific ones about the post-colonial, while I'm using the term strictly in chronological sense, post 1947. I can't tell you, I mean, what kind of changes happened over time, but I have a feeling that that must have influenced the ways these memorials were kind of, thought and remembered, and maybe these documents and these narratives played a role in understanding these kind of the new understanding of these memorials in the national history. If I don't know if I think that even like tentatively does not answer your question.
No, but I mean, just in guidebooks, do they, the Indian language vernacular guidebooks, do they actually mention that memorial?
Yes.
And they say you can get inside, or do they
No, you can't. You cannot. Oh, actually, what they mention is that if you get a kind of because Kanpur was also one of the biggest cantonment of North India, it says that if you go to ask from the cantonment, head of the cantonment, if you could ask for a pass, you could get into it, and some of these authors, interestingly, came from such level high, such social status in Indian society, most of them could get access to these memorials. The same with the Allahabad fort. It was also transformed into a military base and there was no access, but most Indians got, or at least those who wrote these travelogues, had access to these places. So probably that also made their kind of, they could experience it in different way, and they had a position of, come to think of it, they had a position of relative advantage vis-a-vis their compatriots, yet at the same time their inequality rankled. So probably that's why these brought out such a kind of a tense narrative, as opposed to like the European guidebooks, which just portrays it as like atrocious barbarity of Indians, that sort of a thing.
I'm not someone monopoly on this, but
no.
Do they go back to Tipu Sultan, or is it just Indian mutiny? Do they go to surrender the town?
You have brought upon a question which was like the third part of my chapter, and I didn't read it out here. Simply because, Tipu Sultan and the entire south of India is an interesting issue altogether, because most of these travelogues, even if they claimed to be, and most of them are titled very ambitiously Bharat Brahman, which means traveling around India. Yeah. My argument here is that the way they even conceptualized India was very North Indian, simply because it had the kind of, it had the mythic sacred and also sites of Hindu versus Muslim kind of conflicts, which was missing in some ways, at least in certain ways, in a certain intensity in southern India. Tipu Sultan wouldn't even appear in there. Tipu Sultan was not what I can say, not a nationalist, or not even a patriot for them. Their patriot consisted of, not surprisingly, Shivaji, Maharana Pratap, and the sites of national pilgrimage would be Chittor. So that's what I said. This had implications for Indian society, which which comes out very prominently. The way the territory is conceptualized, and the way who belongs to this territory is conceptualized, more importantly.
Question?
Yeah, go on. Liz, I was interested by this sort of accompaniment of 50. And who these people were, particularly thinking of, there must have been local experts, or people taking them around who knew the ground, the area, the topography in essence very well, and whether you've got any sense of that.
I think that's a really interesting question. So it's one that Fairweather brings up at a different point in that diary. He's actually quite dismissive of the ability of the people that he's travelling with to orient themselves, and it's an interesting situation, because those 50 people won't be the same 50 people who travel with him through the whole journey. As he kind of goes through different areas, they'll tail off and then be replaced. I suspect perhaps the cook and the wife and the child probably went all the way, but they are being advised about routes to take by messengers who have a completely different function in the sort of colonial administration. So the messengers have sort of their own networks between different kind of administrative centres and the different kind of villages, and the messengers will be advising them from how to travel from place to place. And as they travel through, the chiefs and the headmen of the villages will be advising them on routes. But my general sense is that so Northern Rhodesia is a very large country which is very sparsely populated, and in fact most of the local people will be for the majority of the time only have knowledge of a very small area and the routes between larger areas. So they won't have a sort of general knowledge that you might kind of anticipate, that like I know London, for example. I would know, like, so I live in Brixton, they'd know Brixton very well, and they'd know how to get to Bloomsbury, but like all of the area between that they wouldn't necessarily have any familiarity with. They'd know the routes because there would be routes through the bush which you could see, in fact, because they would be, I mean, you'd pass down them, they'd be sort of like corridors, as it were. But yes, it's a kind of, it was quite different than I had imagined that it would be. And I have the feeling that Fairweather is quite keen on using the compass instead of listening to the people that he's with, interestingly, who are obviously, at least to some extent, the experts. I mean, he says several times that I think he believes in a sort of mythical capacity that they have. So he says, you know, that if they're from the area, then they can kind of get you to the right place. But if they're not from the area, then they're useless. I mean, in the sense that I think he expects them to be able to sort of read the landscape in a different way than he does. And so I think, there are occasions when they get lost, and he's really angry and it's raining, but it seems to me that he sort of also pushes against that by insisting on sort of going through it like on a straight compass bearing between the place that he wants to be and then the place where he thinks he might want to go, rather than using the sort of pre-existing routes. But that's partly a sort of interpretation of how he describes that process.
Just for Liz again, I was interested in the kind of the ideas around professionalism and expertise and what training qualifies you to be a certain person, because I'm sort of working on the kind of issues with the interface of amateur, when the amateur becomes a professional, who is establishing, who's conferring that authority upon them, and then how is that expressed and to whom, which struck me as really interesting in this case because of the early kind of very much qualified by being on the ground, you know, kind of working out, as you said, the expertise is actually being gleaned from various places as well as science, and then how that maps over the periods. I'm just interested in hearing any more about, you know, that sort of idea of who is, how are you asserting your expertise, and how it's been mobilised somehow. Yeah,
I mean, I think that it's interesting that if you sort of read. If you read the sort of sources that come from the kind of public statements made by people high up in the Ordnance Survey or people who are involved in the RGS, then you have this notion that there's a very sort of fine, extremely scientific skill which is surveying. And as far as I can tell, there are people who sort of get sent off to sort of reorganise how mapping is done here or there, and those are people who are supposed to have this. I think that most of that actually comes from experience rather than from qualification anyway. But the people, so there is through the period. So for example, in Nigeria, there is the Institute of Chartered Surveyors in the UK, and the people who are sort of apprenticed, as it were, within the survey department, sort of one by one might become chartered surveyors in the United Kingdom by passing various kinds of chartered tests. None of the African surveyors in Northern Rhodesia are ever, as far as I can tell, in the colonial period, become chartered. But that isn't the case in other African colonies. So in Nigeria, there are surveyors who achieve chartered status within the British Institute of Chartered Surveyors. But then the sort of the way that education, the way that European education is kind of introduced to Nigeria, and the sort of the length of time over which that happens, and the kinds of general skills which are taught to people is very different. So I think it's one of the things that I'm very interested in. So I mean I could talk a lot more about it, but but thank you.
I've got several questions and comments. Actually, it's partly arising from these recent discussions in reverse order. That one about professionalism, which I think is very interesting. The Survey Department of India grew out of course, military surveying, but there was a surveying school set up in Madras very early, if not the late 18th century, very early 19th century. And then surveyors from India, from that department, went off around the world. I mean, they went to New Zealand and they went to Australia, places like that, taking their techniques which they had developed. And of course they were being developed at the same time in the mapping in Europe. So I was curious about why this, because I thought, well, you know, of course at certain levels this would not have been the case.
Mm-hmm.
But broadly speaking, if you were trying to map a country or map a route for a railway or something of that sort, I'm surprised that we weren't either not necessarily child space from Britain, but certainly people that were part of this growing 19th century professionalisation of surveying.
Mm.
So it may be that what you just said at the end, that there's a special case, that it's not that's true everywhere. I mean, we know that for the colonial service, for example, there were district officers and so on who got fed up in the 20s from India and went off and worked in Africa. And there was a kind of migration of these skills of different sorts around the empire. So it's interesting. So that was the first thing that struck me. I was also interested in the idea of really relates in some ways to Aparajita's paper as well, is the relationship between maps and the imagining of place. Right. And in India, the map of India becomes an icon. It's reproduced. There's a temple to it. I mean, there's that shape, that sort of triangular shape. And the idea that there's a natural borders, which are the Himalayas and Hindu Kush and so on, and the oceans, is vividly displayed in a form which derives directly from European cartography. I mean, the sort of cartography which pre-existed this, which is a cartography in which importance determines scale rather than some proportionality. That continues to exist, but it's replaced by this notion of a European shape on a map, and that has a tremendous effect as an image. Interestingly affected by partition, but anyway, before that, it's there. Now, how does Zambia imagine? I mean, it's not quite as attractive and easily. It's a strange shape in a way.
Yeah.
But
it is.
is there an imagining of the place of Northern Rhodesia or subsequently Zambia which is map related in any way, or is it not? Is it to do much more with experience of space in terms of landscape and indeed loyalties, human loyalties and so on? Is it that sort of thing? Or does the map play any part in that setting? Because it certainly doesn't end here. And my final point was about the sort of panoptical effect that you were describing to India. Actually, I think the difference you draw between the Indian surveys and the Zimbabwean surveys are not as absolutely perhaps as all that. There were many, many gaps. And there was indeed a claim to omniscience, or at least not a claim, an attempt to be all-embracing. But there were also many, many blank areas, both in terms of space and in terms of areas of knowledge, which were well and truly recognised, and it differs from different parts of India. So I think you would find quite a lot of things which were similar, actually, to and they did their, again, parallel to your question, but maybe different. There was the same relationship between the individual surveyor and the local informant. Same sort of expectation that they'd understand the scientific thing that they're trying to do with triangulation and astronomical measurements and so on to place the things. But that rocky outcrop, what's it called? Who does it belong to? What's it used for? What are the products of this area? It's all down to local informants. And so there's a kind of value given to this. And then when they get interested in the historicity of these landscapes, an enormous attempt to gather artifacts, information, and data from these. Admittedly, they go on about how unreliable they are. But there isn't a choice. So there has to be a kind of relationship between them. Yeah, they had 50 bearers and goodness knows what else as well, and hundreds of camp followers. But they went to a locality and they had to sit. Well, they had first of all to make sure that they weren't going to be attacked as terrible interlopers who were doing a damage by providing this knowledge. And having established that, they would then get, and they would have these people write down, oh, this is called this, and this belongs to this. And that was what took most of the time actually was getting that sort of, so there must surely have been something of that going on, even in a sparsely populated place like Zambia. So those were my 3 or 4
So
discursive and rambling comments.
I'll try and answer some small points in those quickly. So regarding the influence of Northern Rhodesia is perhaps an exception, and this is something which I can't really speak for other areas as well. So, but as far as I can tell, both the political administration and the survey, the white surveyors at work in Zambia are extraordinarily static. They don't have a kind of imperial career. They spend most of them arrive in Zambia as their first post, or Northern Rhodesia, and they seem to stay there. So that is something which I definitely need to explore. Interestingly, so slightly earlier in Malawi, or in Nyasaland as it was then, there was an attempt to, in fact, Indian surveyors did come over and were working in Nyasaland, but that was, it was considered unsatisfactory for reasons which the only source I have on that isn't able to explain. So I don't really know what to think about that. It's interesting that in the 1890s there seems to be quite a lot of talk about this kind of stratification of different kinds of work, which is more or less what I'm exploring, and that sort of the technical level work is very appropriate for people, for colonised people of India, but that seems to sort of disappear in a way which I haven't really kind of I haven't really followed up.
The same thing happens in India. It divides into specialists.
Right.
So you get people doing cadastral surveys and people that are surveying property, and the teams are specialists.
Right.
Increasingly, as time, not at the beginning of the 19th century, but by the 1860s and 70s, it's become, well, not professionalised in the sense of just using it, but it's divided up.
Right.
And people do different jobs.
Right. And very quickly on the sense of place. So Zambia is this strange shape because it's sort of this area. Oh no, I can't. When I show you on the computer, that doesn't make any sense. Oh, I can use the mouse. Excellent. Yes. So this area here is largely Barotse. Well, now it's the western province of Zambia, but it's largely Barotse land, and is the homeland of the Barotse, who are the people who negotiate basically all of the sort of southern chunk of Zambia. So it isn't all technically speaking. They negotiate on behalf of people who aren't, strictly speaking, paying tribute to them. So they don't strictly have the right to negotiate for on behalf of. But this area of Zambia still has different laws regarding the distribution of land and chiefly rights. And then this half over here again is there's I think 73 languages in Zambia. There's a very strong ethnical diversity, which I think sort of makes any kind of sense of a whole very complicated for everybody. But again, in this region, there's another tribe which has a very strong hierarchical structure, and again, kind of negotiates on behalf of peoples who they don't, strictly speaking, have the right to negotiate on behalf of. And it's also the product of the movements of the British in 2 directions. So from East Africa. So from East Africa in this direction and from the south in that direction. So it's a sort of leftover, as it were. So I don't think that there's ever been a sort of imaginary of, I mean, the Zambian map features, of course, in sort of contemporary sort of various things to do with the states and so on, and Zambia as a kind of, and Zam as a sort of prefix is completely ubiquitous for all kinds of things. But I don't think that the shape of the country ever has that kind of, or I don't think there's an imaginary that you could really describe in that way. People don't really use maps in Zambia. That's also, I mean, I think, the idea of a guidebook, for example, is I mean, it's hard, it's very difficult to find a European guidebook to Zambia, and I don't think that there are any Zambian guidebooks to Zambia, even today. So it's a very different kettle.
That's interesting, because I don't think it's about the shape, and it's not about diverse languages, because there's hundreds of languages.
Sure.
In India.
But there is a couple of unifying myths.
Yeah.
There's a sense of
right.
that over the millennia this is a place.
The sacred geography.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you clearly can't do that with Zambia.
No, not at all. So I think that, and regarding the third point, I think that the difference in the sense of this kind of is that the processes happen so differently. So while there's I mean, I know that it doesn't follow exactly according to plan, but there's a sense in which you do the sort of the astronomical location first, and then you do the triangulation, and then you do the sort of topographic detail, and that just that doesn't bear any relation to the order that the mapping takes place in Zambia or in Northern Rhodesia. Obviously the copper belt is extremely well mapped. Again, I'm sorry, I used the mouse. The copper belt is extremely well mapped from very early on, and then the routes, again, the route along the railway belt has very detailed, even soil surveys and various kinds of things before, for example, there's almost any information about here or here, and there's no, the sort of, a proper geodetic structure that carries right across the entire territory only happens when the DCS do their work in the 1950s. So it's a very inverted, yeah.
We have a question in the corner. I was wondering with Aparajita, whether you want to say anything before then, or okay. So if there's a question in the corner, maybe just a couple more.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that. Go back to sort of sacred geography very loosely. In Indian travel writing, we were sort of talking earlier about the attitudes in Indian travel writing to apparent Indian barbarity, like the Indian rebellion. This is a very sort of selfish and specific question because it helps me with my research, but I was wondering what attitudes there are to, and how much mention there is of memorials to the other barbaric practice of sati, so sati temples, sati memorials. And I'm also particularly interested because you said that sometimes Indian travel writing reproduces ethnographic stereotypes, and I'm actually looking at the fact that although there's a sort of monolithic thing that the British hated sati, I'm looking at what they sort of did in Bengal, but actually when it happened in Rajasthan and the brave Rajput people did it, it was altogether different. I was wondering if that's replicated at all in Indian travel writing.
Thank you, that's a very interesting question. And yes, sati memorials, there's no mention of it in Bengal, where it was quite, and I mean, there's nothing to do. But as you have noticed correctly, when it came to Rajasthan and sati memorials, it was seen as something as quite kind of not only an act of valor, but more importantly as an act of resistance against Muslim male aggression or male sexuality being expressed in a kind of a putatively threatening manner. But more importantly for me in this entire idea is that because sati memorial or mutiny memorials are a different kind of memorial, and in which way they were interpreted or their importance were interpreted, I think has got to do with the fact that how these authors were also thinking through as they're traveling, thinking through the role of Europe and Europeans on their, on India, and what kind of sometimes benefits, sometimes advantages, sometimes disadvantages it brought to them. So in some cases, while it was admitted that some things like sati is barbaric in a modern context, where you can clearly see that they are appropriating themselves as, they are kind of representing themselves as modern and as something which kind of it's a very good thing that it happens no more, and there is no mention of having kind of that the sati was ever practiced in Bengal or anything like that, probably because they were conscious in creating they were self-representing themselves in a very conscious way. So there is no mention that Bengal ever had sati. It's a very interesting thing. But when it came to Rajputana, it said Rajputana had sati. It's a barbaric practice, but when it was practiced, it was not barbaric simply because it had a kind of a more glorious motive, if you want. And that motive, now comes the most interesting part, that motive has now been completely discounted by Pax Britannica. So Britain has imposed that the British rule is more peaceful, more equitable, and if not anything else, at least more charitable towards Hindus. So Muslim rulers and their aggressions have given way. So there is no need for us to practice, to kind of perform practices like sati. Parda, veiling women, and there is so many references to Parda, including like Sati memorials and things like that, that Parda is a practice which was brought to us by Muslims. There is no such precedence, which is again not really quite accurate, but there is no such precedence in Hindu India. So we must go back to the Hindu ways, simply because the need for kind of behaving in certain norms and manners have kind of, does not exist anymore because it's the British rule. So it's very interesting the way, that's why I claim here that there is no straightforward or linear narrative. It's interesting to see what evidence at what level is picked up and kind of almost appropriated or changed or modified or completely transformed either, or appropriated to reach very, very different conclusion for specific ends. And that's what makes these travelogues very interesting. There is no linearity. You cannot reach a very easy conclusion about them. So that's what interested me in these travelogues, yeah, and what they kind of, what these evidences bring out, if that answers your question.
Okay, do you have any more, any final questions? Okay. In that case, we'll, I think we've got some drinks in the corner. I don't know if we've got white wine or red wine. Due to our budgetary limitations, we have to rotate it. But before that, let's just thank Liz and Aparajita once again for 2 fantastic papers.